We are back and we are joined by Cea Weaver, director of the New York State Tenant Bloc. Cea, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there are over 9 million tenants in the state of New York. I learned this from you guys. There are 2.4 million rent stabilized tenants in New York City. I'm one of those folks, and this call here that you guys are getting behind is about a rent freeze for these rent stabilized apartments. Can you explain what that is and why you're choosing to organize around this proposition?
Right. So like you said, there are about 2.4 million people who live in rent stabilized apartments in New York City. And, tenants really could be a difference maker in this mayoral election. Rent stabilized tenants have their rent adjusted annually by a set of mayoral appointees. And we believe that, the people who want our votes should commit to freezing our rent at a time when the cost of living crisis is at the front of mind for almost every single person who's trying to afford to stay in New York.
And who are the candidates that are behind the rent freeze? Zoran Mondani is one of them, but there are a few, candidates that are polling towards the bottom that also support a rent freeze. I mean, I want everyone to get behind Zoran, spoiler alert, but.
I think Zoran Mamdani has endorsed a rent freeze. So has Senator Jessica Ramos, and so has former Assembly Member Michael Blake. And so the city's comptroller Brad Lander has said that he supports a rent freeze if the data supports it, which is great news because the data does support it. And I think really also importantly, DC 37, which is one of the largest public sector unions in the city, has said that they support a rent freeze, and they really just think, it is clear to people who are running for mayor that if you want to be elected, you need tenants to vote for you, and this is something that the mayor can promise, the mayor can deliver on, and we think it's really important for getting into office.
And why does the data support the rent freeze, particularly for this block of rent stabilized apartments?
So, the rising cost of rent is pushing New Yorkers out of the city. There's just no two ways around it. It feels silly sometimes to even say. 1 in 4 New Yorkers can't afford the basic things that you need to live. Gentrification is pushing people out of the city. New York City's Black population has declined by nearly 200,000 people over the last 2 decades. That's about 9%. The reality is that unless we do something about the cost of rent, the city's going to look completely different. Rent stabilized tenants are a multiracial, multi-generational block of voters. We're not just talking about, progressive young people. We're not just talking about people who are already politicized. We're talking about a potentially enormous working class voter block who are with us because right now they're being forced to choose between childcare or groceries or healthcare, staying in New York at all, right? So the importance of a rent freeze is not just about the rent. It's also about bringing working class people back into its civic engagement. It's about giving people something to believe in politics when right now you look around and you're like, what really is there to believe in?
Right. And it just occurs to me when we're having this conversation about gentrification, that term, right, which is a very real phenomenon, but it's secondary to the phenomenon of gouging people on their rent, right? I mean, this is, it's almost a frustrating definition of our housing crisis to put it on that, because it's almost like, an individualized kind of guilt thing or whatever, as opposed to this is a massive structural problem because we're pricing out so many people so that, I don't know, folks can buy an apartment in Midtown, millionaires, and that asset can appreciate, and then they can sell it for a profit. I mean, that's the core problem here.
I completely agree. I mean, when I say gentrification, I really mean a process by which bankers and real estate speculators and landlords are colluding with one another to drive up the cost of housing in the city at the expense of working class people. I don't mean gentrification as a sort of force is not something that's caused when one person moves into your neighborhood, although it might feel that way. It's not as though every single, young white people woke up one morning and were like, you know what neighborhood looks good? Bed-Stuy,
Yeah.
There was no sort of collective decision on behalf of that class of people. The reality is that gentrification is bad for everybody. It's bad for older working class residents. It's bad for people who've been living in their neighborhood for a long time. It's bad for people who are looking to move to New York City for the first time. And it is something that is caused, like you said, really through real estate speculation. And I think rent stabilization and rent freeze are just such an important way to interrupt that cycle of speculation, displacement, and rising rents across the whole entire city. It is the way that we can tell an entire class of real estate owners that this building is more important as a home than it is to, lining your pocketbooks.
And can you speak to how rent stabilized apartments would even be subjected to rapid rent increases is this outdated legislation that doesn't truly stabilize the rent? What's behind that?
Well, it's a really good question because, recently somebody just jumped into the mayoral race, the former governor. And, during the sort of 10 years that Andrew Cuomo was governor, we lost hundreds of thousands of rent stabilized apartments to a loophole in the system called vacancy decontrol. The tenant bloc organization that has a sister organization, Housing Justice for All, and we worked to strengthen and expand rent stabilization in 2019. We were able to get rid of vacancy decontrol, and sort of that's a system where when you move out of your rent stabilized apartment, the landlord can bring it up to the market rate. Because of vacancy decontrol, something that I think Andrew Cuomo bears a lot of responsibility for keeping in place. We have lost a lot of rent stabilized apartments in the city. We are no longer losing rent stabilized apartments, but the truth is that decades and decades of real estate friendly loopholes led to a tremendous loss of affordability, and we're still trying to catch up. When Cuomo was in office, rents went up 33% in the city, homelessness increased by 50%. He was not a good governor for rent stabilized tenants, and I hope that people are starting to remember that, and we're certainly going to work to try to help them remember.
How did the pandemic affect rental prices? Again, I'm in a rent stabilized apartment, but it was bought and then sold, thankfully, by basically a commercial real estate conglomerate where they didn't do any repairs. They flipped it, right? So they bought my building during COVID for a cheap price, cheaped out on repairs, and then sold it kind of recently, basically. My sense is that that's a kind of regular phenomenon and has been over the past few years in the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think it's before the pandemic even. It's really just sort of baked into the system. The truth is that whether your rent is high or the sort of how much you pay in rent has nothing to do with the quality of your housing. The reality is that your landlord is going to charge as much as they possibly can for rent. That's just what they're going to do. It's not as though the quality goes down and then all of a sudden you're paying less, and so the landlords. I think at base, the problem here is that the landlords have too much power to control how much rents go up in the city. And, really thinking about who is on the rent guidelines board for rent stabilized tenants and who gets to put them there, it's the mayor, is really critically important to keeping rents low.
Right. So how can people in the city get organized behind this? And how can folks, even if, we have listeners all across the country, if they want to do something similar in their city or their state, what would be your advice for them?
So two things. So first, the New York State Tenant Bloc, the organization where I work, is organizing renters to take back power from the real estate industry over our homes, our neighborhoods, and our entire democratic system. Our goal really is to combine the economic power that tenants have over their homes with the sort of sheer political majority that we have in New York City. in order to both like elect a mayor who will work for us, but also to bring working class voters back into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has really abandoned working class people, has abandoned tenants, right? We saw that in this most recent election. And we really think that, if we want to beat Trumpism and if we want to beat the far right, we have to be offering working class voters something around cost of living. And as homeownership is out of reach all over the country and increasingly out of reach all over the country, the way to interrupt that is to get organized as renters in your community, to fight for policies like rent control, to push to elect people into office who are going to respect the tenant majority, who are going to deliver policies for the tenant majority. So that's our theory. That's our theory, right? Our theory is that by running pro-tenant candidates, by forcing candidates to adopt pro-tenant policies, by electing tenants into office, we can sort of interrupt the sort of race to the bottom that we're seeing across the entire country. And by the race to the bottom, I mean the race to the far right. In terms of what we're doing in New York City in this election, this election is just the beginning, but we are knocking on hundreds of thousands of doors. Our goal is to build a 250 strong person voting bloc that is going to only vote for candidates who will, work for tenants once they're in office, work for the majority once we're in office. We are talking to people every weekend. We are really thrilled about the reception that we're getting at the doors. People are hungry for a renter mayor.
And in terms of the mayoral primary, this is June 24th? Is the date right, Bradley? Okay. Yeah. But again, I'm getting a nod from Cea. So I think that's the primary in the city, June 24th.
Okay.
What would you recommend? Like, ranked choice voting can confuse some people, right? Would you recommend leaving off anybody that doesn't support the rent freeze?
We are urging people to vote for candidates to support the rent freeze. And I certainly would not want somebody to sit the election out. So I would encourage people to try to rank 5. Your ballot will, you want to make sure that your vote gets counted. And if you don't exhaust your ballot, your vote might not get counted if your candidate at the top of the ticket isn't in there. So we're trying to build a slate of rent freeze candidates, and we're working hard to get there. We think we've seen a lot of momentum so far, and it's just the beginning.
Well, we have 3.5. I mean, we have 3, and then Brad Lander says he would support it if the data supports it, but we need one more to add to the full ballot. Don't leave it blank. But it's more, my question really is like, in terms of trying to get a candidate out of the primary that supports a rent freeze, it's probably the most, it's probably the best course of action not to rank somebody who you think is the most odious on that front. Okay.
Certainly, and I would certainly want to say here that it's really important to not rank the governor, who I think has a proven record, the former governor who has a proven record as an enemy of rent stabilization.
Yep. That's really what I was getting at, but I didn't want to be as explicit in case you didn't want to say it, but you did. So I appreciate your time today. Folks, check out the New York State Tenant Bloc and get organized if you're in the city or even across the country. This is a really important and crucial time period for you to organize in your communities, and a great way to do that is to organize against the landlords that are gouging you. So really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. And if you do, I thank you so much for having me. And if people do want to get involved, you can go to rentfreeze.nyc to check out our materials, to get support and talking to your neighbors, and get involved in our campaign.
All right. We will put a link to that wherever people are listening to or watching this in the description below. Thanks so much, Cea. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.